Because the work of Immanuel Kant with regard to aesthetics in particular is an important point of departure for Pierre Bourdieu's materialist and sociological understanding of culture in his book Distinction, let's begin with Kant. We can glean an important difference between Kant and Bourdieu by comparing the titles of the works they wrote. The section of Kant's book that I asked you to read comes from the Critique of Judgment, a work of philosophy that's divided into a critique of aesthetic taste, for which this book is best known, and a critique of teleological judgment, which has to do with space and time, and that does not concern our topic. Kant's book is part of a larger philosophical system that includes the critique of pure reason and the critique of practical reason. As Kant uses the term critique, it means an examination of the scope and limits of our cognitive powers, or what we might call broadly reason. Hence, the critique of pure reason tries to decide to what extent, if any, our cognitive powers permit us to discover a priori, or before experience, and especially pure truths about the world, about objects, about space and time, about the order in nature, about ourselves, about freedom of the will, and the possibility of morality, and perhaps even a God. The critique of practical reason examines what reason can do, but this time not in relation to theoretical knowledge, but in relation to actions in the world. Kant argued that reason allows us to know what ought to be done by reference to a priori moral imperatives, and covers topics such as free will and the practical application of moral judgments. Getting back to the Kant that we're reading, you'll also note the subtitle Analytic of Aesthetic Judgment, with another subdivision under that called Analytic of the Beautiful. We find in this text a series of carefully worded propositions that describe several moments people pass through in their judgment of taste, with taste being the ability to recognize pure beauty. It's important to observe the specific definitions of key concepts here, as well as to be aware that Kant's philosophy does not start from the beautiful itself, that is, from the direct beautiful object of perception, but from the judgment, someone's statement about the beautiful. He's interested in the mental operations that process external objects to determine whether they are truly beautiful. What is so unique about Kant is that such judgments express something in the subject, but those subjective judgments are nevertheless universally valid, as if they concerned a quality of the object itself. Turning now to the title of Pierre Bourdieu's work, Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste, we notice two departures from this obvious allusion to Kant. First, by the word distinction, Bourdieu is not referring to the process by which someone like Kant separates the meanings of similar words and concepts in the interest of absolute philosophical clarity. He intends it in the commonplace sense we all do, a mark of superiority, and in particular a mark of class superiority. Secondly, Bourdieu is examining the social critique of the judgment of taste, not the kind of abstract, universal judgment of taste that Kant is talking about. To put this another way, Bourdieu is restoring to the real world of class fractions, class identities, money, and educational institutions a concept that had for hundreds of years remained essentially ahistorical, metaphysical, and above economic and sociological investigation. In other words, Bourdieu is extracting and combining meanings of the word culture that, as we have already seen, developed separately to signify quite different things over its long history of development out of a common root. One line of that separation casts the term into what Bourdieu calls in this statement, quote, the restricted normative sense of ordinary usage, unquote, by which he means culture's most modern application to the fine arts, refined manners, literature, drama, painting, and music. You might even add to this fashion and haute cuisine, the aestheticization of dress and dining. His point here is that all of these things have taken on a transcendent, abstract, value-laden set of qualities that linger close to something more spiritual than having their origins in the material, social, economic conditions that are the generative foundation of culture used in this sense. Whereas we can point to Matthew Arnold's work as a possible first step in reintegrating this ethereal sense of culture back into the real political and social contexts of his times, there is also a way in which Arnold's discussion of culture as a love of perfection and as a process of self and collective development that retains something of the ideal of what the harmonious goal of that process is. When Arnold speaks, for example, of our best selves and points to the state as the aggregate of those best selves, we're closer to the idealist philosophy of Kant and Hegel than we are to the materialist foundations of Marx and Engels. Bourdieu, in great part, is coming out of that Marxist tradition, but he is also part of a much more diverse group of intellectuals who, from the 1890s on, might be grouped under the category of anti-Kantians. Thus, the provocative image Bourdieu uses at the outset of distinction is meant to reconnect the seemingly transcendent nature of aesthetic appreciation and cultural refinement back to its sensational roots, back to physical processes, actual taste, actual bodies existing in the material world of natural forces, and the social world in which those forces are harnessed and redirected in the name of an order that is often constructed upon brutal disparities and unequal resources. Hence, Bourdieu tells us that one cannot fully understand cultural practices unless culture, in the restricted normative sense of ordinary usage, is brought back into culture in the anthropological sense, and elaborated taste for the most refined objects is reconnected with the elementary taste for the flavors of food. I'll have a bit more to say about this, but for now I just want to emphasize Bourdieu's openness to and appropriation of different disciplinary practices in his work. In addition, it should also be noted that the field of anthropology as a social science is fairly young, having its academic origins in the 1870s. It was at that time that an anthropologist named Edward B. Tyler consolidated the meaning of culture in a way that both set out the field of inquiry for that study and that provided a way of thinking about cultures more broadly. His highly influential definition went this way. Culture, or civilization, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. The condition of culture among the various societies of mankind, insofar as it is capable of being investigated on general principles, is a subject apt for the study of laws of human thought and action. On the one hand, the uniformity which so largely pervades civilization may be ascribed in great measure to the uniform action of uniform causes, while on the other hand its various grades may be regarded as stages of development or evolution, each the outcome of previous history, and about to do its proper part in shaping the history of the future. By the time of his death in January 2002, Pierre Bourdieu could be ranked among France's most important intellectuals, including Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard, and Jacques Derrida. Internationally famous for his research and writing that transformed the field of sociology, Bourdieu was also a well-known public intellectual who did not shy away from the vexing political issues of his own time. He became something of a cult hero in France, as attested to by the huge success of a documentary film about his life and work entitled Sociology is a Martial Art, which you have seen. The book we're beginning to discuss is a landmark text, voted one of the 10 most influential books in sociology by the Sociological Association. Distinction is unique in its combination of philosophical theory, methodological innovation, and rigorous research. It is a book that introduced into our collective vocabulary of the study of culture such important concepts as the field of cultural production, cultural capital, habitus, social space, and the logic of practice, as well as doxa, which I'll explain as we go along. You'll note as you read the text echoes of Thorstein Veblen's concept of conspicuous consumption, which you will see in the text called The Theory of the Leisure Class. You will also see an extended quarrel with the dominant theory of aesthetics propounded by Kant, which, to oversimplify a bit, suggests that aesthetic judgments have nothing to do with the social environments we inhabit. What's so astonishing about Bourdieu's exalted position in French intellectual circles is how humble and untraditional his background was. Bourdieu was born in a remote village in the south of France in 1930. This rural enclave at the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains was so isolated that the native population all spoke Occitan, a medieval version of French spoken in Languedoc. This was far from Parisian French, and Bourdieu only got rid of his heavy accent when he attended college. In the documentary you watched, he admits to feeling sickened and violent whenever he hears this accent used in other people. Bourdieu's father was a postal clerk, and as a young man Bourdieu spent much of his time with the children of peasants, factory workers, and small shopkeepers in a nearby village known for its archaic traditions. His last book in press before his death was in fact an ethnographic study of these childhood villages, in which Bourdieu diagnosed the crisis brought about in peasant life by the dislocation of marital strategies and gender relations. The book is called Le bal de célibataire, crise de la société paysanne en Berne, or in English, The Singles Ball, Rural Crisis in Berne. Near Born was a town called Pau, where Bourdieu was a boarder at the public school. He was an outstanding rugby player. He won a state scholarship and was advised by one of his teachers, an alumnus of the École Normale Supérieure, to enroll in the top preparatory course leading to this elite school. He moved to Paris to attend the Lycée Louis-le-Grand, which brought together the country's brightest students in an atmosphere of intense competition and scholarly rigor. Soon after this, Bourdieu entered the École Normale Supérieure to study philosophy under the Marxist theorist Louis Althusser. He also studied the history of science and logic in reaction to what was then the dominance of Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist philosophy. When he graduated, he chose to teach philosophy at a high school in a small town in mid-central France. And a year later, in 1955, he was drafted into the French army, but rebelled against military authority. For disciplinary reasons, he was swiftly sent to Algeria to serve in the pacification of the North African French colony. This up-close experience of war and colonial uprising changed Bourdieu's intellectual profile forever. The rising tide of Algerian nationalism aroused his interest in Algerian society from a political as well as a scientific standpoint. It also had the practical effect of changing his interest from philosophy to social science. Bourdieu began to conduct anthropological inquiries in the war-torn regions of Kabylia, Kolo, and Orsanis, 3 guerrilla strongholds in which his life was often threatened. He taught himself there to do field work. In this early work, he combined ethnography with statistics, microscopic interpretation with macroscopic explanation, all in order to map out the cataclysmic effects of colonial capitalism and insurgent nationalism. The result was his first book, The Sociology of Algeria, written in 1957 and translated into English in 1962. In this impeccably scholarly book, Bourdieu synthesized historical, ethnological, and sociological knowledge. Algerian society would become the topic of Bourdieu's subsequent 3 books, in which he sought to connect evolving social structures and cultural formations. Travail et travailleurs en Algérie in 1963, Le Déracinement in 1964, and Algeria, 1960, published in 1977 as a collection of ethnographic essays. Essentially, Bourdieu trained himself as an anthropologist, a sociologist, and a statistician under the unique conditions of war-torn Algeria. His empirical research from this period laid the groundwork for his important theoretical book called Outline of a Theory of Practice, which was published in 1972, and in which he first explained his lifelong commitment to something called reflexivity. Reflexivity means a methodological practice by which the sociologist turns his own tools upon his own scientific practice in order to reflect critically on the social conditions and concrete operations of the construction of the object of study. A central concept in Bourdieu's work, reflexivity is meant to control the distortions that the analytic posture, or what Bourdieu calls the scholastic point of view, introduces in the relation between observer and observed, between actual social life and the accounts that the sociologist produces of it. The sociologist, according to Bourdieu, must engage in what he calls a sociology of sociology, so as not to unwittingly attribute to the object of observation the characteristics of the subject. He or she ought to conduct their research with one eye continually reflecting back upon his or her own habitus, their dispositions learned through long social and institutional or educational training. It is only by maintaining such a continual vigilance that the sociologist can spot himself in the act of importing his own biases in his work. In a good illustration of the process, Bourdieu chastises academics, himself included, for judging their students' work against a rigidly scholastic linguistic register or way of writing, favoring students whose writing appears polished, and marking down those guilty of vulgarity, without a reflexive analysis of the snobbery being deployed under the cover of those subjective terms. The academic will unconsciously reproduce a degree of class prejudice, promoting the student with high linguistic capital and holding back the student who lacks it, and all not because of the objective quality of the work, but simply because of the register in which they write. Reflexivity should enable the academic to be conscious of his prejudices and impel him to take steps to correct for this bias. We can summarize 3 major areas of concern in Bourdieu's work up to this time. First, his interest in understanding the relations between culture, power, and social inequality. Secondly, his goal of blending rigorous theory with systematic observation. And thirdly, his recognition of the double objectivity of the social, which was composed of the distributions of material resources and positions on the one hand, and of the embodied classifications through which agents symbolically construct and subjectively experience the world on the other. This last notion is known as habitus, and we'll talk about this in a moment. We can summarize Bourdieu's method as an attempt to unravel the multi-sided dialectic of social and mental structures in the operation of domination. In 1981, based on the strength of his published book Distinction, Bourdieu assumed the chair of sociology at the Collège de France. In 1975, he launched the interdisciplinary journal Actes de la Recherche en Sciences Sociales. What we can make of Bourdieu's work up to this time, and in particular his ideas of art and aesthetics in Distinction, is his intention to tie the abstract dimensions of aesthetic considerations back into bodily functions. In other words, in his practice as a sociologist, Bourdieu is attempting to do several things. To bring into the realm of empirical data things related to the body's habitual gestures, practices, positionings, behaviors, use of language and dietary practices in order to see them as embodied internalizations of objective social structures. To break down the antinomy between objective social structures and the subjective experience of those structures in order to demonstrate an isomorphic correspondence that not only internalizes objective social structures, but in embodying them replicates the hierarchical relations that obtain in those structures. And in regard to the consumption of art in particular, Bourdieu is undertaking a critique of aesthetic theory, especially those theories that tend to split art and questions of beauty away from social determinants. Perhaps the most important influence on Bourdieu's sociological methods and theories was drawn early in his education from the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. In 1949, Lévi-Strauss published a volume called The Elementary Structures of Kinship, in which he demonstrated how apparently different social organizations were in fact just different permutations of a few basic kinship structures. He approached anthropology from the point of view that people think about the world in terms of binary opposites, such as high and low, inside and outside, person and animal, life and death, and that every culture can be understood in terms of these opposites. In the late 1950s, Lévi-Strauss wrote a collection of essays that gave a name to this approach. The book was called Structural Anthropology. Part of Lévi-Strauss's method was derived from Hegel's philosophy of history, which was built around the idea that in every situation there can be found two opposing things and their resolution. Hegel called these thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Lévi-Strauss argued that in fact cultures have this structure. He showed, for example, how opposing ideas would clash and also be resolved in the rules of marriage, or in mythology, or in various rituals within cultures. But by far these structuralist ideas were drawn from a new approach to the study of language that was initiated by the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Lévi-Strauss came to the work of Saussure through another linguist, Roman Jakobson, whom he knew in New York, where both men were living in exile during the Second World War. Structuralism was one of the most important and wide-reaching intellectual movements of the 20th century, and Pierre Bourdieu encountered it at a crucial period in his education. It is often referred to as a linguistic turn because the origin of the method is the insight that virtually all human creations can be understood as though they were structured like language. Saussure had set out to discover a universal system of language itself, that which is common to all languages. He wanted to know how language produces meaning, not what any particular language's meanings are. To do this, he had to change the way linguistics looked at language. Saussure made three moves, which taken together add up to the basic methodological matrix of structuralism. First, he shifted attention from the temporal to the spatial dimension of language, foregoing the historical development and evolution of languages. Secondly, he declared that the relation between a particular sound and its meaning is arbitrary. And finally, he proposed that linguistics should change the object of its analysis from words to what he called signs. Signs are composed of a signifier and a signified. The former is the sound of a particular word, which must be distinguishable from other sounds and reproducible. This is what separates phonetics from sheer noise. The latter is what we generally associate with that sound. It's not a relationship, in other words, between a word and an actual thing, or referent, which would reduce language to a naming system. The sign is not self-sufficient as a symbol, but relies on a system of interrelating differences in order to produce its meaning. To understand the influence of structuralism on Bourdieu's sociological method, we can begin with one of his basic assumptions about the reality of social identity. For him, there is essentially no reality outside of an individual's social relations. To exist at all is to exist socially in relation to others. The self is always a social self, both a product and an agent who exists within a set of social relations. Later in the book Distinction, Bourdieu writes that social subjects comprehend the social world which comprehends them. This would seem to imply that we have already been classified by others even before we, in turn, begin to classify ourselves or to classify others. Individuals would then seem to be subjected, as they are, to forces that cannot be controlled by individual will alone. But the subject is always something more than just subjected, because in the dynamic of social relations, the individual is also what Bourdieu calls a social agent, one who, in turn, classifies. Where do these social dynamics play out? Is the social world one large amorphous collection of people and groups, or is our real social experience more segmented and interconnected than that? Clearly, we don't simply exist in an undifferentiated mass of other human beings, but in fact exist and move between and among structured groups. Some sociologists and early theorists of society view it as something that can be analyzed in terms of some of the larger groups like social class, as, say, Matthew Arnold attempts to do in Culture and Anarchy. But for Bourdieu, subjects come into being through a process of differentiation into semi-autonomous and increasingly specialized spheres of action. These spheres are called fields, and power relations between and within these fields structure human behavior. In order to understand how humans behave, it's important to understand in what kind of power relations they take part. Bourdieu's definition of the field is this: a field is a field of forces within which the agents occupy positions that statistically determine the positions they will take with respect to the field. These position takings being aimed either at conserving or transforming the structure of relations of forces that is constitutive of the field. Bourdieu's work concerns the role of education and other cultural factors in sociology. Instead of analyzing society solely in terms of classes, Bourdieu uses the concept of field. A field is a structured social space. That space has its own rules. It also has its own patterns of domination, levels of prestige, legitimate opinions, and so on. Think of where you work. Think of the university you attend. Think of the team you play on, the chorus you sing with, the family celebrations you attend. Fields are relatively autonomous. In other words, they exist and function in a way separate from the wider social structure, or what Bourdieu would call social space more broadly. The field is where people relate to each other and struggle through a complex of connected social relations. They do this both directly and indirectly. Among the main fields in modern societies, Bourdieu cites the world of the arts, of education, of politics, of law, and of economy. We can get a better grasp of the dynamics of the field by using the metaphor of an actual field on which sports are played. For our purposes, we'll use a soccer field. Each half of the field represents one soccer team. In this team, players occupy different positions on the field, have different functions associated with that position, and can only move within the boundaries that designate that position. The players are what Bourdieu calls in sociology agents. Returning to actual social situations, individuals occupy positions determined by the social field they are in. Sometimes they occupy positions within different fields at different times. On the playing field, each position carries with it different dispositions, as well as likely or potential courses of action for the player. For example, a striker in a soccer team will attempt to score a goal, and a defender will attempt to prevent it. These positions that the agent occupies in the field are determined in part by a number of things. They are not just arbitrary. First, there is what Bourdieu calls habitus, by which he means a structuring structure which organizes practices and the perception of practices for all agents in the field. Bourdieu says that for every individual's personal history, preferences, and dispositions, placed in the context of the surrounding social reality, form a structure that to a certain extent predetermines that individual's potential courses of action in the social world. By these, he means social class, level of education, upbringing, as well as an individual's past choices. All of these form part of the structure he is talking about, and they determine in part the behavior of an agent in the social field. To take the soccer example once again, a player's behavior is analogously structured by his previous training, his physical conditioning, as well as by the quality of his soccer equipment and his tactical prowess at playing the game. Bourdieu's concept of habitus derives from the work of Marcel Mauss, who defined it as those aspects of culture that are anchored in the body, or in daily practices of individuals or social groups, whole societies, or even nations. Habitus includes the totality of learned habits, bodily skills, styles, tastes, and other embodied knowledges that might be said to go without saying for a specific group. In that way, it can be said to operate beneath the level of rational ideology. Habitus is a structure of mind characterized by the set of skills it has acquired, its sensibilities, tastes, etc. The particular contents of the habitus are the result of the objectification of social structures at the individual level of subjectivity. That is, the habitus is isomorphic with the structural conditions in which it emerged. Isomorphic meaning identical or similar in shape or form or structure. In using the concept of habitus, Bourdieu was able to understand a certain behavior or belief that becomes part of a society's structure when the original purpose of that behavior or belief can no longer be recalled and becomes socialized into individuals of that culture. It is also a concept that achieves one of Bourdieu's theoretical and methodological goals, which is to resolve the antinomy of objective and subjective elements. Bourdieu thus sees habitus as an important factor contributing to social reproduction because it is central to generating and regulating the practices that make up social life. In other words, individuals learn to want what conditions make possible for them and not to aspire to what is not available to them. The conditions in which the individual lives generate dispositions that are compatible with these conditions, including tastes in art, literature, food, and music. A central feature of the habitus that distinguishes it from socialization per se is its embodiment. A second structuring principle in field theory besides habitus is doxa. Bourdieu defines this as the universe of tacit presuppositions that organize action within the field, the rules of the game, so to speak. Doxa, in sociological terms, refers to the learned, fundamental, deep-founded, unconscious beliefs and values taken as self-evident universals that inform an agent's actions and thoughts within a particular social field. Doxa tends to favor the particular social arrangement of the field, thus privileging the dominant and taking their position of dominance as self-evident and universally favorable. Therefore, the categories of understanding and perception that constitutes a habitus, being congruous with the objective organization of the field, tend to reproduce the very structures of the field. A doxic situation may be thought of as a situation characterized by a harmony between the objective external structures and the subjective internal structures of the habitus. In the doxic state, the social world is perceived as natural, taken for granted, and even commonsensical. Therefore, habitus is an important factor in social reproduction because it is central to generating and regulating the practices that make up social life. Individuals learn to want, as I said before, what conditions make possible for them and not to aspire to what is not available to them. The conditions in which the individual lives generate dispositions compatible with these conditions and, in a sense, pre-adapted to their demands. Improbable practices are therefore excluded as unthinkable by a kind of immediate submission to order that inclines agents to make a virtue of necessity or refuse what is categorically denied and to will the inevitable. Habitus and field are proposed to unite social phenomenology and structuralism because they can only exist in relation to each other. Although a field is constituted by the various social agents participating in it, and thus their habitus, a habitus in effect represents the transposition of objective structures of the field into the subjective structures of action and thought of the agent. Doxa essentially means rules that agents in the field agree to insofar as the game is worth playing. For example, only goalkeepers are allowed to touch the ball with their hands. However, agents don't always agree on the doxa or the rules of the game. In his definition of field, Bourdieu also says that agents occupying positions aimed at either conserving or transforming the structure of relations in a field. Agents who take positions aimed at transforming the power relations will try to change the rules of the game to win their own benefits. One player, for instance, would suddenly want to use his hands as well. The players who are attempting to preserve the status quo, the doxa, will not agree with this, and the struggle will ensue. Bourdieu says that in this struggle, players, or in sociological terms, agents, make use of their power or capital to impose the rules that favor them the most. Although these specialized concepts like field, habitus, disposition, and doxa may not be apparent in the reading you've been assigned, they implicitly inform the entire method behind Bourdieu's study of taste in the book Distinction, and they are worth knowing about in order to understand the larger project of his work. To return then to our original topic, why do we, as students of the concept of culture, want to concern ourselves with something like the question of the beautiful? In art or in nature, isn't the beautiful a subjective judgment arrived at by an individual by way of their own unique taste? Let's take an example from the world of art to test the idea of taste. As you look at these images, I want you to do the following. Now, as you look at these 4 paintings, without thinking too much about them, what I'd like you to do first of all is to select the image that appeals most to your sense of tastefulness. Second, identify the image you find the most tasteless. Third, which of the images do you think you ought to find the most artistic and the most tasteful in the context of an economic class above your own? And 4, which of the images do you think you ought to find the most artistic and the most tasteful in the context of an economic class below your own? Okay, the first question to ask yourself is why the same image could not have been selected as the answer to all of these questions. If, as Kant defines it, taste is the ability to judge the beautiful, why haven't these different contexts of taste produced one standard of beauty? The answer simply is, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. But is it? For Kant, one has to begin with the idea that beauty is not the property of an artwork or a natural phenomenon, but is instead a consciousness of the pleasure which attends the free play of the imagination and the understanding. Even though it appears we're using our reason to decide that which is beautiful, the judgment is not a cognitive one. It's not logical, but aesthetical. Therefore, a pure judgment of taste is only subjective insofar as it refers to the emotional response of the subject and is based upon nothing but esteem for an object itself. As Kant says, in order for me to say an object is beautiful and to prove that I have taste, what matters is not so much that the object exists before me, but what I do with its representation within myself. When we look at a beautiful object of art or in nature, we take that object in through our senses. We sense some object is there in the first place, which Kant calls an objective intuition. But the object also makes us feel a certain way, producing a subjective feeling in us, or a sensation. I look at a bright green field that registers its color on my retinas and produces a physical sensation of agreeableness that belongs to that part of my mind that registers subjective sensation. Kant says we call agreeable that which gratifies us, which in turn we call beautiful. We are not using reason or cognition to decide this, and because we find beautiful that which is agreeable to us, we are said to have an interest in it. Feelings of pleasure and displeasure are determined by the individual's experience of the world, the way in which we are exposed to comparisons and contrasts as our life moves along. I used to think one kind of landscape, one kind of automobile was beautiful until I saw a more beautiful landscape or automobile at another point in my life. These experiences and judgments belong to my physical sensations and impressions, and therefore have nothing to do with the pure cognition that Kant has in mind as the true standard of aesthetic judgment. They have nothing to do, for example, with the object itself and its reality. When we move beyond the merely agreeable response to beauty and begin to esteem the object as good, we are basing our judgment upon a disinterested pleasure, and we feel in that process that pure judgments of taste lay claim to universal validity. This universal validity is not derived from a determinate concept of beauty, but from what Kant simply calls common sense. We feel, subjectively, what is in fact a universally applicable judgment of taste. Let's take the judgment of taste in art a little bit further. Here are two paintings taken from the previous example. Both of them feature women. One is a portrait of a woman seated at a writing desk, and the other, as we know by the title, is a nude woman descending a staircase. Without knowing anything about either one of these paintings, or even that they are hanging in a museum, what would my taste draw me to? The painting on the left looks like real life, or is at least closer to a real woman that I've actually experienced visually than the so-called woman in the painting to the right. There are feelings evoked on the level of sensation when I look at the painting on the left. The colors might be said to have a warm hue. The slightly out-of-focus quality of the painting appears to soften the whole scene. The content has a rich sense of leisure and wealth about it that appeals to my sense of manners and refinement. On the other hand, the painting on the right seems full of sharp angles and jagged lines. There's no discernible human form to be seen and identified with. It's more machine-like than natural, more vertiginous than calm. I pronounce it something my 7-year-old could draw with a pen and a ruler. It's too abstract and non-representational to mean anything to me. I'm not, Bourdieu would say, disposed to respond to this painting. Why is that? Well, I don't go to museums. I was never taken to one. It never occurred to my parents to do that, or to have art books, encyclopedias, novels, books of any kind in the house. Money, time, entertainment, eating, church-going, sports, school, jobs, all ate up time, so that even now that I have money, time, and desire, I still would not go to a museum, or the opera, or the ballet, or a reading group without feeling like a stranger to myself. You see where I'm going here. Let's raise the stakes a little more. I know a lot of movies, say, old and new. I can tell you the plot and who stars in them, while my friend only knows a very few popular movies. I mention, say, the Italian film The Bicycle Thief or Fellini's Satyricon, and she mentions Bridget Jones' Diary and The Wedding Singer. And while I'm a movie buff, my other friend, yes, I have at least two, knows directors, especially auteur directors and avant-garde directors. He has more discerning taste in going to movies. He gives a little dismissive huff when I proclaim The Godfather a masterpiece. He knows something I don't, and it makes me feel, well, stupid and tasteless. But back to the paintings. One viewer knows that the one on the right is painted by Marcel Duchamp, an avant-garde modernist trying his hand at cubism here. So he knows the school of art to which the painting belongs, as well as the historico-cultural moment in which it was painted. His father was an art dealer in Paris, his mother a Harvard-educated art historian. My friend even has a sister who is a renowned performance artist who once made the terrible mistake of dating James Franco. In other words, my friend has cultivated, or been largely born into, a disposition that allows him to move beyond the merely sensible properties that characterize the primary stratum of art that can be grasped on the basis of ordinary experience alone. He gets the secondary meanings. He is a member of that cultural nobility, as Bourdieu would put it, that loves and recognizes legitimate art. He has mastered, or simply inherited, the codes, the names, the ciphers that give him high cultural competence to spot the code into which the cultural objects before him are encoded. He has his schemes of perception. He knows more than the beholder who lacks the specific code and feels lost in a chaos of sounds, colors, lines, without rhyme or reason. This enhanced experience of culture means that he forgets the acquisition of these tools and is therefore closer to legitimate cultural apprehension. He has, in other words, the aesthetic disposition. Pure art, as Bourdieu claims, asserts the primacy of the mode of representation over the object of representation, while the popular aesthetic of, say, working-class people expect every image to explicitly perform a function, if only that of a sign, and their judgments make reference, often explicitly, to the norms of morality or agreeableness. They systematically reduce the things of art to the things of life. Bourdieu goes on to write that the denial of lower, coarse, vulgar, venal, servile, in a word natural enjoyment, which constitutes the sacred sphere of culture, implies an affirmation of the superiority of those who can be satisfied with the sublimated, refined, disinterested, gratuitous, distinguished pleasures forever closed to the profane. That is why art and cultural consumption are predisposed, consciously and deliberately or not, to fulfill a social function of legitimating social differences. The pure aesthetic, writes Bourdieu, is rooted in an ethic, or rather an ethos of elective distance from the necessities of the natural and social world, which may take the form of a moral agnosticism, visible when ethical transgression becomes an artistic parti pris, or of an aestheticism which presents the aesthetic disposition as a universally valid principle and takes the bourgeois denial of the social world to its limit. The detachment of the pure gaze cannot be dissociated from a general disposition towards the world which is the paradoxical product of conditioning by negative economic necessities, a life of ease that tends to induce an active distance from necessity. Kant, on the other hand, insists that there are universals implanted within every human being, things like cause and effect or unity, and underwrite the very possibility of understanding, which means our ability to process, organize, and comprehend the data given to our senses by the outside world. We never know directly what he calls things in themselves because we process sensory data through pre-existing mental categories. Kant would be the first to admit that we need a body to receive sensory data, that as physical creatures we are all subject to physical causality, but we are equally thinking beings who use ideas and reason, and this is why we are free. The very word aesthetics presents us with a contradiction that Kant tries to overcome in his philosophy. The Greek root of the term means of the senses. So how do we get from the sensible world to the supersensible realm of reason and freedom? Beauty is the key, because beauty is experienced through the senses, but it also points us beyond mere sensation. How does it do this? Kant's aim was to establish the subjective universality of the judgment of beauty and the sublime. I judge the object in front of me, for example, a table, by way of simply subsuming it into a concept that I already have, the general concept of tables, or tableness. Now, even though the statements, "it's beautiful," and "it's a table," are identical in form, we're more likely to disagree over the first one. Why? Because beauty is not a determinative concept like even numbers or tables. Beauty is instead a reflective judgment. The ability to judge well amid such uncertainties is called taste. Some people, we say, have better taste than others, although Kant would insist that everyone has the potential to achieve the highest taste. Kant would agree that taste is learned, so in this sense his claims square with those of Bourdieu. Where they differ is in Kant's denial that taste, therefore, is culturally relative. Kant makes a distinction between what is agreeable, what is good, and what is beautiful. The good is a matter of reason and of what we should desire. The agreeable is a matter of the senses and of what we physically desire. The beautiful is unique in that it mixes the sensible with the non-sensible and involves no desire whatsoever. This is why Kant calls judgments of beauty disinterested. This idea of severing the beautiful from any interest is the most influential and problematic theory bequeathed to us by Kant. His basic notion is that a sensory experience of pleasure can move from the subjective, it pleases me, to the objective, it should please everyone, only if purged of its individual interested elements. Take the example of flowers. The flowers have no purpose in relation to my life or my physical needs. I can contemplate them disinterestedly, and so my judgment about their beauty is not connected to their gratifying my personal sensibility. When I say those flowers are beautiful, instead of I think those flowers are beautiful, Kant would say this solicits everyone's agreement in a way the statement I like mashed potatoes does not. I mention this use of disinterested because, as we've seen, Matthew Arnold extends this Kantian idea to the concept of culture itself. Part of the criticism about Arnold's culture and anarchy is the same as that directed towards this entire Kantian tradition. Because Kant is trying to demote the physical appeal of the aesthetic, he claims that the formal properties of the observed objects, not their physical or material properties, most influence judgments of beauty. Sensual responses are purely subjective. When you accept this view of aestheticism, it entails making a crucial distinction between useful and non-utilitarian objects. Art is for art's sake and nothing more, which gets immediately complicated and compromised when you consider art's relationship to, say, commerce. Can art ever be something that transcends all petty worldly concerns? Kant would answer this with the idea that art and beautiful objects reveal to us a purposiveness without purpose. Art objects, in other words, aspire to general purposiveness in the absence of any concrete purpose. Why is this important for Kant? Because when we apprehend beautiful objects, we're responding with free play of the mind. The aesthetic, therefore, provides an experience of freedom within the physical world of causal determination. We balance or harmonize that human freedom with our human immersion in the world of sensation. Finally, for Kant, each artwork, like every judgment of beauty, solicits its audience's approval both as a particular and as an example of a genre or a kind or an act of criticism. For that reason, there is no rule of beauty. Its validity is established on a case-by-case basis.